Today, I have the special privilege of welcoming one of America's most successful young entrepreneurs to the Haymaker podcast, Vivek Ramaswamy. He's also a New York Times bestselling author. And in addition to that, he is the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biopharma company. He's also got a new book out now called Nation of Victims. In addition to that, he's got a new ETF out with the symbol DRILL, DRLL, from his Strive Asset Management company that he co-founded. And he's done all this at the ripe old age of 37. Do I have that age right? Is it 37?
It is 37. Yeah.
Come on, you got to do more with your life. I mean, that's just not much to put on your CV.
I'm trying to stay busy, do a couple of things here and there, but I need to. My wife says we need to take a vacation, so that's what we might be doing this fall as well at some point.
Well, I've waited 22 years since my last one, so I'm a bad person to talk to about vacations.
I would bet.
But anyway, what an exciting week it's been for you. You've been on CNBC with an interview. You've had a Wall Street Journal article written about you, which I happen to have right here with a picture of you. You've also had a Bloomberg Magazine article that was published on you. That one was a little snarky, and we could probably come back and talk about that. I thought there were some unfair comments in there. But I really want to thank you profoundly and profusely for being on here, especially at the end of such a hectic week. So thanks very much. And
I've been looking forward to this. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So the big story, I mean, you got a lot of stuff, obviously, that's gone on this week, as I just mentioned, but the real big item is your letter to Mike Wirth, the Chevron CEO. And I just thought I'd read some highlights of what you said in your letter. The growing supply-demand imbalance for energy around the world creates a unique opportunity for a great American oil company like Chevron to meet that need. We respectfully call on you to lead Chevron with the exclusive objective of maximizing long-run value for the company's ultimate owners while disregarding social pressure applied by certain of the company's large shareholders. And the shareholders is in quotes. And I know you're taking a bit of a swipe at the big three of asset managers, including BlackRock. Then you go on to say fossil fuel producers have systematically underinvested in oil and gas production since 2014, which leaves them unable to meet rising global demand due in part to the demands of ESG. And you also say that chronic underinvestment now leaves the world short on production precisely when demand growth is strong. And of course, there's the European energy situation. I'm injecting that part of it, where they're desperately short of hydrocarbons. So you point out that since June of 2018, Chevron stock is up 30%. Its earnings are up 234%. Tech profits are up about 70%, but their stocks are up over 100%. And you attribute this to the underinvestment aspect, where presumably investors are reluctant to go into the sector because they view it as kind of a melting ice cube, since they're not really replenishing reserves the way they did in the past. But don't you think, and this is a lead into one of your main themes, but don't you think that's more a function of ESG hostility as opposed to the company's reluctance to invest?
Yeah, so it goes hand in hand. I mean, these aren't either or questions, David. They should go together. What's happened over the last decade? I'll give you a much longer story and a short version of it. It was probably a story that you know well, but in the early 2010s, we began a period of chronic low interest rates. It actually dated back even further than that, but from the 2010s onward, we've lived in what seemed like perpetually low interest rates. That's only begun to change very recently, which on one hand caused investors to ascribe really high multiples to tech and anything that rhymed with tech, biotech, clean tech, health tech, et cetera, fintech. But the reason why is that when you get very little return on your cash in the bank, investors have an incentive to then relatively value more highly cash flows in the far distant future, cash flows after 2030, after the period that they can model. It's what you call the terminal value of a firm. You apply a high terminal value, which says that, okay, if that's going to be the distant future that's so promising, I'm going to apply a high price to earnings multiple for every unit of earnings today. So that's what happened in part as a consequence of the low interest rate environment. However, that same low interest rate environment did a couple of things for the U.S. energy sector. Okay, I think that combined with the shale oil revolution and some other gifts created an embarrassment of riches for the sector that fostered some lack of capital discipline. Let's admit that. In the early 2010s, companies overspent, they overgrew, they overproduced, and then OPEC put its boot on the neck of the industry with its supply glut in what, 2014, you had the oil price crash. So there were a number of factors that caused investors to say, all right, we need to tighten up spending in this sector, improve focus on capital allocation and returns to investors without overspending and overgrowing. Now, that's a short-term impulse. And what happens is that markets generally equilibrate from these short-term impulses. If they start underinvesting then too much, some other investor is going to come in with a new mandate. This is where the ESG movement came. Okay, so what the ESG movement came in and said is, okay, yeah, not only were these companies not capital disciplined, they're also failing to align with the future direction that the world is heading. That there is no fossil future after 2030, or after, pick your year, favorite year. Some would say 2030, some would say 2040. That this is an industry whose core product is going to be irrelevant. It's going to be a dinosaur. It's going to be a fossil. Fossil fuels will themselves become fossilized after 2030. And so not only should companies stop doing this for the short-term reason of restoring capital discipline, of overspending, this is what they need to do over the long run, because we're now in the middle of this great energy transition. And so what the ESG movement effectively did was disguise what was a short-term equilibration mechanism of less spending in capital investment to be able to deliver greater returns to investors in the short run. It disguised that with the veneer of moral legitimacy and long-termism measured over a multi-decade time horizon. And so what happened was, the first step is what you said, is investors in the ESG investment movement, the large capital allocators like BlackRock on down, were hostile to the energy sector, which in part contributed to price earnings multiple compression, less capital flowing into the sector, more funds flowing into tech and other sectors away from U.S. energy. But then that in turn resulted in the demands on the sector to say that actually you need to invest less in fossil fuel production. This is the way of the future. And so then investors can't actually even apply a high multiple that accounts for future growth if the companies themselves are underinvesting themselves. And so that's how you get to this paradox that I point out between 2018 and 2022, where not a lot of people recognize this in the markets. It shocks people when I first tell them. Earnings growth in the U.S. energy sector, it wasn't just Chevron. Earnings growth in the U.S. energy sector overall dramatically outpaces earnings growth even in U.S. tech between summer of 2018 and summer of 2022, the last 4 years. Yet, tech prices, stock prices, dramatically outperformed those of U.S. energy stocks because of that price to earnings multiple disparity. And so my view is, when the companies themselves begin to invest now for growth to capture the opportunity created by a half-decade long underinvestment in fossil fuel production, those companies can actually be appropriately valued as growth companies, just like technology companies. And this is part of a broader worldview that I have certainly bring to the table, thinking that we could be in the beginning of what I call a great reversal between the fortunes of U.S. tech and U.S. energy, as we now enter a higher interest rate environment that disfavors long-run terminal values being applied to sectors like tech and biotech, but also a generational supply-demand imbalance in U.S. energy that creates an opportunity for U.S. energy producers if they're unshackled by the ESG handcuffs that have been imposed on them. And I think that you could see dramatic multiple expansion in the years ahead if we're able to take those ESG shackles off. So I know that's still a long story. I said I was going to make short. It's still a long story anyway, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the macro picture that informed the backdrop for my letter to Chevron this week.
Thank you. Well, there was a word that you said a few times in there, if, and it is a big if. And I think that right now the energy companies are looking at it pragmatically and saying, yes, we're willing to invest, but extremely selectively, and particularly in areas with quick payback. So I think that's why you're seeing the super majors, like Chevron and Exxon and Shell, that really weren't players in the Permian to much of a degree early on. It was really the independents that made that miracle in the Permian Basin. And now the big guys look at that because they can get production out very, very quickly. And of course, there's a very high decline rate. And that's the drawback of relying so much on shale. And I think we're producing right around 12 million barrels a day currently in the United States. And about 9 million of that is shale. And amazingly, about 5.5 million barrels a day comes from the Permian alone. I mean, it is probably the most remarkable basin in the country, or the world, actually, outside of perhaps Saudi Arabia. So getting back to your CNBC, and actually this was an interview you did last month on CNBC, and you were talking about ESG, and they said, well, what's your...
Can I just respond to one thing you said in there, David, before you switch gears? Because actually what you said about the Permian is remarkable. I actually flew to the Permian Basin yesterday. spent some time there. I gave a talk at the Petroleum Museum, which, by the way, blew me away. I was just left in awe of the history there. It was my first time actually at the Petroleum Museum down there, but I figured if I'm talking this much about these issues, I might as well show up and educate myself. So I did a little day trip there yesterday from Ohio, where I am now. Yeah, I'll say one thing. You're right about companies, and I think it's smart for companies to look at the payback period even as they're willing to increase investment. But that's a bit of a paradox when you juxtapose it to their other increases in investments, more dramatic rates of increase in investments in areas that do not have any foreseeable payback period at the same time. Here, I'm including the set of not just U.S. energy companies, but even if you take a look at some of their European counterparts, the BPs of the world, companies that have for decades or longer been built on expertise in hydrocarbons and in molecules, now suddenly shifting to unknown investment in electrons, even in wind and solar. I mean, this is the juxtaposition where on one hand, we'll say that we'll exercise capital discipline, but we need to say short returns, short payback periods, great shale is the place to go. I'm not against any of that. I think that's an appropriately disciplined way to look at increasing capital investment. But that juxtaposed against the $10+ billion commitments made by each of these companies to their new energy divisions, especially the ones that are even moving away from molecules to electrons, is mystifying against the veneer of capital discipline that they've applied to their increased investments in core fossil fuel production and in their core, competencies and core capabilities. So I just wanted to point out that, yes, they are saying that, but actually, if you look at their new energy or so-called new energy investments, it doesn't track that mandate or that mantra at all, which I think you'd agree with.
Yeah, and you actually touched on that in your August CNBC interview that I was referring to, where you said it's really hard to define ESG. What is it? What is it truly? And certainly, there's a lot of bizarre aspects to it. I mean, if I'm not wrong, Tesla's been kicked out of most of the major ESG indices, and yet some energy companies are in there, and so there's some odd things, and that's getting a fair amount of criticism. Kind of validating your point in that interview. But in that interview, you did mention the fact that it's not that you're opposed to energy companies going into these more alternative energy areas, but they should stick within their core competencies, where they really have a competitive advantage. For example, carbon capture. And I know that you are a fellow shareholder in Chevron with Warren Buffett. He owns a little bit more than you guys at this point, but maybe that'll change. But he's also a very big investor. He owns roughly 20%, I believe, of Oxy. And Oxy's been one of the leaders in carbon capture. And with a practical application, it's not just pie in the sky. They're using that for industrial applications, enhanced oil recovery, et cetera. And you also mentioned hydrogen. Do you think that some of the energy companies could actually have a competitive advantage in developing hydrogen as an alternative fuel source? So any follow-on thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, my general view is investing where you have a competitive advantage to capture an actual tangible business opportunity, that makes all the sense in the world. I think what's happened, though, is we're having a two sides of the mouth talking problem in the ESG movement, all right? So where the ESG movement actually was born, and it's closer, bigger brother, cousin of stakeholder capitalism, it was born with, I think, an authentic and earnest intention. It's not one that I agree with, but it's an authentic and earnest intention that deserves reasonable consideration, which said that businesses need to earn their social license to operate. What does that mean? And this is a longer historical story, but it's important, so I'm going to tell it, which relates to a core claim of the Klaus Schwab economist-led movement against Milton Friedman, that in the state of nature, companies did not have limited liability. Man and society created this legal invention called limited liability that said that you, as the shareholders of a company, get all of the upside legally, but also are legally bound to pay for none of the liabilities that you incur from the negative externalities of your business. That somebody sues you for a negative externality, for polluting their water, whatever it might be, you as the shareholder cannot personally be held liable, even though you personally derive all of the upside from your own activities. That was a paradox. Milton Friedman never addressed it. This is a good argument. I personally think it's the best argument for stakeholder capitalism in the ESG movement. But even if you listen to the kind of things that Larry Fink was saying as recently as 2018, he was saying things like businesses need to earn their social license to operate. I think it's a legitimate point of view. Reasonable minds can debate this proposition. Now, what's happened in recent years, though, is that in the wake of pushback, intellectual pushback, including from folks like myself, but even including more recently, political pushback, and then legal pushback, recognizing that, well, we do have a fiduciary duty in this country that demands that asset managers and corporate boards of directors exclusively look after the financial best interests of their shareholders or of their clients. We've seen a jujitsu-like move in the dialogue, which says that, oh, no, guess what? All that stuff we said about earning the social license to operate, yeah, maybe we meant that, but actually ignore it. We are also doing this because it is in the sole financial best interests of the firm. And I think that was fundamentally just false. It was a lie. It was a lie at the heart of the move that the ESG movement made, saying that it was at once about maximizing long-run value for shareholders and about earning a social license to operate and do business. The first of those was authentic. It demands debate. Unfortunately, it runs into conflict with fiduciary law in the United States. But the second of those was cover, that now, I think creates the veneer of companies saying that they're, investing for the long run because there's an inevitable climate transition going on and energy transition going on, and this is how we make money over the long run. But they don't actually believe that that's the motivating reason or justification for why they're behaving in the way that they do, which is why in the letter to Chevron, I specifically honed in on the Scope 3 emissions proposal in 2021, because that's where that's an example of where the rubber hits the road.
Let me just stop you for a second, because a lot of people don't know what Scope 3 is, and it's a very important and I think very unfair topic. So maybe just explain what you mean when you say Scope 3.
Fair enough. Rein me in if I'm kind of going in too many different directions and too quickly here. So, yeah, fair enough. So Scope 3 emissions refers to the emissions not just of a business themselves through their own activities, which roughly you can call Scope 1, or through its own usage of power and electricity, which you can call Scope 2, but all of the emissions in its supply chain, both upstream and downstream of the company itself. And so if you're a company that adopts a Scope 3 emissions cap or a Scope 3 emissions reduction plan, that means you're responsible for bringing down the emissions of anyone who supplies your company, but even anyone who buys your company's own products. So in 2021, something interesting happened. There was a shareholder proposal offered by a Dutch nonprofit called Follow This. It was founded by a former refrigerator salesman who was really, I think, earnestly interested in fighting climate change, that put up a shareholder proposal that said Chevron needed to reduce its Scope 3 emissions. And credit to the nonprofit, they were very transparent that their goal had nothing to do with advancing the business interests of Chevron, but had to do with taking on the inevitable fight against global climate change and moving the ball forward. So credit to them, they were honest about that. Now, the curious thing is BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, three of the largest asset managers in the world, the three largest passive asset managers in the United States, wielding over $21 trillion in assets under management across all three of those institutions, voted using their clients' money in favor of that Scope 3 proposal. This is a bit of a mystery, right? And this is where the rubber hits the road on the double speak that I was talking about. If you think that companies need to earn their social license to do business through in part apologizing for their negative externalities, and that's your reason for voting in favor of this, I credit the Dutch nonprofit. That's their reason for voting in favor of it or putting up the proposal. But that could be a coherent basis for voting in favor of a Scope 3 proposal. But that's not what these firms say, because they're using other people's money to vote in favor of that proposal. And many of those other people don't agree with that social goal. Those other people invested expecting to maximize their return on investment. And so the puzzle is, why was it in the best interests of Chevron as a business to adopt a Scope 3 emissions reduction plan? Here's the dirty little secret, David. The answer to that question is there is no good business justification, because the only way for Chevron to reduce Scope 3 emissions effectively is to sell less of its product. It would make about as much business sense as McDonald's voluntarily committing to reduce the body weight of anyone who's ever eaten a Big Mac without asking the consumer to share in any of that responsibility. It is asking Chevron to take responsibility for the emissions from every Amazon truck that burns its fuel without Amazon taking on a reciprocal obligation in return. That makes no business sense for Chevron. So the funny part about the story, though, is that in 2022, after folks like myself and others have called out this hypocritical behavior, or at least this paradoxical behavior, in 2022, BlackRock and State Street at least voted against a similar Scope 3 proposal that came up on the ballot again, but their reasons were really telling. So State Street's stated reason for saying in 2022 they voted against the Scope 3 proposal was that actually that Chevron had already listened to the company in 2021. Chevron was already doing what State Street demanded with the 2021 proposal, and that State Street had engaged in conversations with the companies like Chevron that had guided its behavior. BlackRock said something really similar. So that was their fine print stated reason for their 2022 vote. But then publicly, Larry Fink goes on television, like weeks later on Bloomberg television, and says that their reason for voting against the Scope 3 proposal in 2022 was actually that he didn't want to be the world's environmental police, and that he's always been against Scope 3, with making no mention of their 2021 vote. Now, why is he saying that? Because Republican attorneys general are criticizing BlackRock for breaching their fiduciary duty. This is doublespeak. It is a
180 for sure. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about your Scope 3 analogy and the extreme potential for double, triple, quadruple counting was your pizza analogy. And that
you're counting the same emissions many times all the way down the chain, right? It counts in Domino's Scope 3 emissions. It counts in Uber's Scope 3 emissions if they're delivering the pizza. It counts in the person who ultimately eats its Scope 3 emissions, but somehow Chevron, who sold that same unit of fuel, is going to count that unit of fuel getting burned 4 times over in Chevron's Scope 3 reductions plan. But I then come back to the question. There's all kinds of technical questions with Scope 3 that I could bore your audience with, that some of which were laid out in the letter. But at the end of the day, the most important question, all of those technical issues aside, is that why is it in an oil company's best interest to reduce the use of its own core product by its own customers? The answer is it's not. And if this is a problem, great. If Scope 3 emissions are a problem, let's deal with it through the front door of the political process, where we can debate this in the open through free speech and open debate in the public square, where every citizen's voice counts equally. Great, that's democracy. But resolving this in cloistered boardrooms, and by the way, other things that Chevron did, announce its support for the Paris Climate Agreement in response to this shareholder pressure. Advocate for a carbon tax. Last time I checked, Apple did not become the world's largest company in the world for advocating for a tax on smartphones. Amazon did not advocate for sales taxes for online retailers. It did the exact opposite. That's how those companies became behemoths. Why is it that an oil company needs to be pressured into advocating for a sales tax on its core product, or for the Paris Agreement, or for Scope 3 emissions? It's this apologist expectation that, and Mike Wirth, I give him credit. The reason I picked Chevron actually is that one of the reasons at least, is that I think its management team is actually quite good. It's exhibited some courage. The letter he wrote to President Biden earlier this year, standing up for the oil industry. I think that shows evidence of some courage there. And Berkshire Hathaway, by the way, is a large shareholder. It's not just the big three that own this company. So there's a lot of reasons why you could believe that a shareholder could have more positive impact here than in other companies. But at the end of the day, these companies are ruining their own business models because their own shareholders, and I use shareholders in air quotes because they're not the actual owners of the company, are demanding that they advance these social, cultural, environmental, and political agendas that have nothing to do with the actual best business interests of the company. But it's disguised in the veneer of long-termism because we're in the middle of this great energy transition, when in fact that has nothing to do with the actual policies that have been foisted on these firms.
Yeah, well, that's a great overview, and it does get to the heart of what's happening right now, where obviously there's tremendous pressure to restrict the use of fossil fuels. And that's been even more acute in Europe than it has been in the United States. And now Europe is seeing the wages of that. As you know, they've gone from being, they were never as energy independent as the United States is today, thanks to shale. If it hadn't been for shale, we'd be basically in the same situation Europe is. But if you look at the charts of their domestic energy production versus their reliance on Europe, in Russia, those lines have gone absolutely opposite directions. So they're now extremely reliant on Putin, and they're paying a horrible price for that. And I actually wrote one of our early chapters of my book, Bubble 3.0, last fall. We published it early. That's one of the advantages of doing it digitally. And that was one of the themes. Even this is last October, before Putin invaded by months, and how horrific energy prices were already at that point. And it's just this, we all, I think, are very pro the environment, and we'd love to have less pollutants emitted. This is one of the paradoxes that we're dealing with right now, is the desire to improve the environment, but at the same time that we're trying to go very quickly. And I think that's one of the things that you would agree with. One of the aspects of the whole, what I call the great green energy transition, that is extremely problematic, is the speed with which we're trying to make this transition happen. And obviously Europe is paying a significant price for that. I mean, as you're well aware, their electricity prices are, they recently hit the equivalent of $1,000 a barrel oil. Their electricity right now, it's come down sharply, but they're still something like $500 a barrel oil for electricity. And their electricity prices, even before this, have been 2 to 3 times what they have been in the United States. And this idea that we can make this really rapid shift over to renewables and quickly eliminate fossil fuels. Getting back to this idea of what's happened in Europe, and is the European energy situation really a hallmark of this accelerated transition that is the politicians around the world desperately want to have happen, a very fast timetable. And the sacrificial lamb has been superficially fossil fuels, but in reality, it's the consumers. And the consumers in Europe, and the energy bills that they're being hit with right now, are absolutely staggering. So while we've been trying to do something very noble from an environmental standpoint, we're creating extreme energy poverty in many countries. And it looks like it's going to get worse rather than better. And obviously there's a better way to handle this. So what would be your view of trying to balance this environmental improvement with not impoverishing people, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people?
Look, I have a lot to say on this. Some of this may, run afoul of much of the current consensus, but I'm going to make 2 points, and they're different points. The first is, I am a skeptic that the energy transition is even, the so-called energy transition, we should say, is even desirable. Okay, at the end of the day, over the course of the last 100 years, the climate disaster-related death rate, the number of people who die of weather-related disasters, is down by 98%. For every 50 people who died in 1920 from a climate-related disaster, 1 dies today. And you ask yourself why? It is the same reason. It's at the heart of this debate. Innovation powered by fossil fuels, where people are able to control their temperatures, the buildings in which they live, etc. We have built resilience to the effects of climate change precisely because of fossil fuels. Now, look at what's happened to extreme poverty over that same period as well, reduced by over 1/3 globally. So I think the impact on human beings, on human flourishing, on the way humans live their lives, my friend Alex Epstein talks about this frequently as well. This is the metric that actually matters. And against that backdrop, an energy transition is not meaningful as an end in itself. It's meaningful as a means towards the end of what actually advances human flourishing. And I think the debate is far from settled that we should even desire to transition away from fossil fuels, versus thinking about how we can more effectively use fossil fuels. How can we balance environmental considerations and respect and be as gentle as we can with the environment through advances in innovation, even within the field of burning fossil fuels, without automatically assuming that even the destination of transitioning away, however fast or slow, is even a desirable destination, let alone then the issue that you raised, which is the speed with which we're doing it. Now, the speed with which we're seeing calls to do it raises a different issue. It's sort of related to the first, but it's a different issue, which is that, ironically, there is a climate transition. It's going in the wrong direction precisely because of the moves of the energy transition. Now, how is that? Why would that be the case? Well, it turns out that the United States and Canada and Norway are among the cleanest places on the planet to produce fossil fuels, to produce carbon-based energy. Yet in a global energy market, when the ESG movement, for example, makes its demands asymmetrically in the West without applying those same standards to places like Russia and China are picking up the slack left by Western nations like the US and Canada and Norway that reduce fossil fuel production. So what's the net effect that has? Well, guess what? There's more methane leakage in Russia than there is here in the United States, by a lot. It's true in China too. Methane is 80 times worse for its impact on the atmosphere as it relates to global warming than even carbon dioxide. Yet somehow we consider that to be a positive transition in the right direction. On the terms of this movement itself, it's actually a transition in the wrong direction precisely because of the haste with which it's implemented. And so some of this might seem to be a mystery, but then you get into, I think, where the story takes a cynical turn, where let's say even this maniacal obsession with carbon dioxide emissions as the metric were the right metric. I don't believe it is for all the reasons I've just said, but let's say it were. You might believe that the greatest opponents to carbon emitting forms of energy production and energy utilization would be in favor of the greatest and most effective source of energy production that is completely carbon neutral, that is nuclear energy. And yet you see the same hostility of the ESG movement towards fossil fuels is almost leveled with similar hostility against nuclear energy. Vanguard's ESG funds, I think by rule, still exclude nuclear energy companies. Now that's a bit of a mystery. So then you get the question of what's actually going on. And this is where you can call this cynical, but I have to tell you, David, my conviction in this has only gone up over time. That the problem with nuclear energy for this movement is not that it fails to solve the energy problem that they call for. It's that it solves the problem too effectively. Because what happens when you solve the energy problem, the so-called energy problem and its associated climate crisis, is that once you've solved that problem, it can no longer serve as a vehicle for advancing the other social agendas that you're using the energy debate as a Trojan horse to actually implement policies that had nothing to do with climate change and had nothing to do with an energy transition. Because the asymmetric demands of Western nations to reduce fossil fuel production while making no similar demands in Russia or China, and last time I checked, it was supposed to be global climate change that we were combating. Well, what that does is that actually solves for a broader standing societal consideration relating to economic equity, that the West had unjustly advanced economically at the expense of the rest of the world. And this debate about climate change and the energy transition was really about what they call climate justice, was really about the broader fight for the human struggle for justice, dismantling the colonialist structures of the last 200 years. I mean, that's the kind of thing we can listen to Greta Thunberg between lines or followers. This is actually what's at work. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying it's a different ideology than one that just relates to energy policy or climate change. And that's the parsimonious explanation that accounts at once for the otherwise inexplicable hostility towards nuclear energy, which actually solves the energy crisis, but does it parsimoniously while still allowing those inequities to persist, while also explaining the transition of energy production from places like the US and Canada and Norway to Russia and China, even where they're dirtier. The straight line of an explanation you draw through those otherwise puzzling demands of a movement that isn't abiding by its own self-stated goals is that its self-stated goals weren't really its goals. They were an attack on human flourishing, and particularly Western human flourishing itself, as a way of achieving greater global equity, which I'm not saying isn't a valid debate, but if that's the issue at work, then we should talk about that openly, rather than disguising that in the Trojan horse of the energy policy debate. And I don't think anyone's actually put their finger on it. Maybe a lot of people think it and don't say it out loud. Maybe it's non-obvious to people. To me, having studied this, for the better part of this year, and I'm a lot newer to this than you, so sometimes you have a benefit as an outsider with having a fresh perspective, and sometimes you don't have the experience base that people who grew up in the industry may have. But what I see as a newcomer who's taken some level of interest in this for the last half year, for the last 6 to 9 months, is that that's actually the heart of what's going on, and we need to start able to debate that by saying it out loud and debating that in the open.
Well, you brought up Norway a couple of times, and I just wanted to cite an interesting factoid that maybe you haven't even heard of. This is actually from JP Morgan's Michael Sempelis, that Norway's EV market share is now 65%, higher even than it is in China. And yet what's fascinating is the usage of oil hasn't gone down at all. There's still the same amount of oil consumption as there was when EVs had a very low market share. And I also wanted to bring up the point that you brought about the idea of divesting energy production to countries that are not as environmentally conscious as the United States is or Western Europe. And I think a good example of what we're talking about is what BlackRock did with Chevron in encouraging or pressuring them to divest certain energy resources, basically oil reserves, to China. And those reserves were actually acquired by PetroChina. And I think that was actually brought up in an op-ed piece that was in this week's Wall Street Journal, the same day that your article ran, by Bill Barr and the Yale professor, Jed, his last name. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And they brought up this very example of, and you don't have anywhere near the environment, really no environmental pressure on companies like PetroChina. And BlackRock is a major shareholder, using air quotes again, in PetroChina. So we don't get any of those types of pressures on companies that are operating in China and other parts of the world. And it's rather like what's happening in the United States, where you've got states like California, which are trying to go hot and heavy EVs, even though the grids are fragile and cracking, and they're going to ban the sale of ICEs. And yet a few days later, they tell people that, sorry, you're going to have to not charge your EVs because the grid is really struggling. And yet at the same time, you've got coal plant construction in China increasing drastically.
That's right.
In fact, coal usage overall in the world just hit a new high, or it's very close to a record high currently.
Hello?
I mean, I guess I'm really asking you, how do you deal with that? And one of the things that I propose is that we really do, if we're going to have a carbon tax, we need a global carbon tax. It makes no sense just to have a carbon tax in the West. And I think that even a global carbon tax, is rather simplistic, because as you alluded to, and I totally agree, there's a big difference between burning coal to produce electricity and all the effluents that go in the atmosphere because of that versus CO2, which is actually the stuff of life. It seems to me that there should be a lower tax on CO2. And you might have brought up methane, that methane is, much more powerful greenhouse gas. And that's a good point. And my energy experts tell me, the guys are actually in the business, that there is an effective way to reduce methane emissions among energy companies. Now, when it comes to agriculture and wetlands and so forth, which are the big methane emitters, that's a much tougher one. But at least the energy industry, I think, has a real good path towards reducing methane emissions.
Yeah, I think, look, this is where the interests of those who focus on financial performance and reducing environmental adverse impact can converge. I mean, you take the methane, liquefy it, you sell it. That's a great product. That is a form of carbon capture, by the way. So people forget that actually liquefying natural gas and selling it, that is carbon capture. But I think that one of the most important strands of this discussion is that, yes, people talk about the hastiness of the speed of the transition. I think that ranking even higher than that as an issue is the asymmetry of its demands in the West versus the East. Because it is at best net neutral in the effect that it has. But in reality, it is not net neutral, because we know of the asymmetries in the cleanliness of production. And then I think there's still this other question that I think reasonable minds can differ on. I don't favor a carbon tax, not because I favor some other means of reducing carbon output, but because I don't even think that we have enough of a basis to say that reducing carbon output is the desirable policy end state, all things considered. And you look at, there's a reason why the nations that have, you know what nation operates according to net zero standards automatically already, pretty darn close to it, is a place like Somalia. Okay, there's a reason why the places in the world that have the greatest human flourishing, the lowest rates of poverty, are also the ones that have lifestyles that depend on the use of carbon. And I think that attacking that unilaterally as the sole basis for addressing concerns about global climate change is misguided on many levels, but including even the very level that's most fundamental, which is why we care about staving off climate change in the first place. That is not as an end in itself. It is as a means to the end of improving the human condition. And I think, to be clear, I'm not dismissing the importance of that debate. I'm just sharing why that debate even matters. We care about climate change. Well, and actually, this is a suppressed premise that's actually worth smoking out. I presume that the reason that we all care about addressing global climate change is as a means to the end of improving the human condition. Now, as I say this out loud, I could imagine the Gaia Mother Earth basis for also addressing impact on environment, which says that no, reducing environmental impact, including the impact on global surface temperatures, is itself an end. That is an end in itself, a worthy end. And I'm not disputing that worldview here, but that would be a completely different premise to say that any human behavioral impact on global surface temperatures, up or down, is per se a net negative that we as human beings have a responsibility to prevent. That's not my view. I don't think that's the view of most people who call for the decarbonization agenda either. I just don't. It might be the view of some, but the way the entire movement is behaving is as though that is their objective, because otherwise they're actually calling for the kinds of behaviors that don't just adversely impact human flourishing in the future. It adversely impacts human flourishing by about as much as you could possibly expect today, instead of asking the question of how might we solve for the area under the curve for all of future human existence, maximize the area under the curve of flourishing over that total future time frame. That's got to be the framework through which we view this. And if we view this through that framework, I think a lot of the decarbonization movement crumbles under its own edifice. It lacks the goods to determine, to actually make the case for why that's going to improve human flourishing more than other ways of addressing global climate change that don't call for decarbonization. And so I think that even the idea of settling on a global carbon tax, while more sensible than the asymmetric one, for the reasons we've talked about, isn't even, in my opinion, at least, the right destination. But I'm not saying my view is definitively right. But this is the kind of debate we ought to be having. It's not the debate we're having today with the quasi-religious fervor behind a movement that in capital markets, ironically, is now even failing to admit that it's about those social agendas in the first place, and says that now it's also about profit maximization, which I think is just a farce at the heart of it.
Right. And I guess one of the points I'm trying to make is I think it's simplistic, and I think it's counterproductive to treat all emissions as the same.
Yeah.
You've already made the distinction between methane and CO2. And again, CO2, if you get below, what are we, about 420, 430 parts per million of CO2 currently, below 280, the planet starts to die. And if you look back at the last 550 million years, according to the scientists, this is actually one of the lowest CO2 levels that we've ever had. So I'm not
actually familiar with this. Can you just this is really interesting to me. Can you just repeat?
I said something you weren't familiar with? That's a shock. I can't believe it.
No, I learn things. I love stuff. I mean, I learn these new things every day. I'm still a newcomer here. So give me the 443 versus 285. So 443 parts per million. That much I'm familiar with, right?
Right.
The carbon dioxide is a percentage of let's say the atmosphere. That's what you're referring to.
But 280 is
the atmosphere there.
I'm no scientist. I'm just relaying what I've heard from people like Stephen Koonin. The 280 is kind of the threshold where you really start to have plants, large scale forest dying, and mini ice age type of scenario.
Yeah, but what'd you say after that?
That if you look at the last 550 million years, this is actually one of the lowest CO2 atmospheric concentration periods we've ever had.
I did not know that.
That's 550 million years.
Okay, interesting.
And I've got the backup on that.
Over how many years? Over how many years?
Pardon me?
Over how many million years?
550.
Over 550 million years. This is one of the lowest. Wow, CO2 percentage representations in the atmosphere. Okay. Very interesting.
And actually, by the way, I want to talk about your book here in a moment, but just to plug another book, Stephen Koonin. I don't know if you've heard of him, Unsettled. And he was a senior energy expert in the Obama administration, so he's definitely from the somewhat left of center. And actually, we're going to run a debate here in the next week or two that he did with a kind of a mainstream environmental. We've got to shut down fossil fuels as soon as possible. It's a very interesting debate because I like to present both sides. And I think what you're alluding to, kind of recurringly in your discussion today and in your books, is that one of the tragedies is that we don't debate. That we get this idea that science is settled and it says one thing and one thing only, and therefore we have to take a course of action, which is could be extremely deleterious to humanity. And I think that what we're seeing playing out in Europe right now is exactly proof of that. Now, I know there are those that would say, "Oh, this just shows that we shouldn't be relying on fossil fuels. We should be all wind and solar." But in every person that looks at it objectively knows you cannot run a planet of 6 billion, 7 billion people that's highly technological and industrialized on wind and solar alone. And this is where we get back to nuclear, which I totally agree with you that nuclear has to be part of the solution. So on that topic, as we know, there's been so much trouble in building, at least in the West, new nuclear facilities. Even keeping the existing ones open has been a huge challenge. Though, in Europe, they're now saying that nuke is green. They're saying that natural gas is green because they're in such dire straits. But have you done much investigating of small modular nuclear reactors and those as a potential solution?
I think it's a promising area. I mean, look, I'm still continuing to learn more about it. And I want to have here's what I haven't gotten is a good articulation of what would be the counter case to this. I mean, I'm not saying this facetiously. I want to get here's what I'm missing is the best articulation of the case against it. And otherwise I'm left with just the cynical explanation I offered before, which is actually the fact that this is just a vehicle for advancing social agendas that have nothing to do with climate change, nothing to do with energy, and that nuclear energy might be too effective at solving the problem effectively, in which case you don't have a vehicle or a Trojan horse to advance the global equity agenda. So short of that cynical explanation, I'd like the best articulation of what the empirical or human condition related case it would be against the adoption of such approaches. Of course, there's the classic hand waving argument against nuclear disaster, but the evidence would suggest that actually with where the technology is today, that risk is just categorically different than any area in which we've actually had a human death resulting from a nuclear meltdown. And so, I mean, maybe you can help me fill that void. But in absence of that, I absolutely think that's where the solution rests.
So yes, as an area I do know an increasing amount about because I'm very close to a company that's probably got the best shot at first fission in over the next couple of years. But it's been a very difficult
next couple of years. That's the first time I'm hearing that.
Right. Well, that's their goal.
Okay.
That this gets to the heart of what the problem has been is that there's been a tremendous amount of money invested, and yet very little has been actually accomplished. I mean, Bill Gates is active with Terra. Then there's not Micronuclear. That's the company that I'm actually supporting, but it's based in Oregon NuScale. And they just haven't been able to get anything on the market, which is actually ironic because when this technology in its basic form has been around since the 1950s. I mean, it's really what powers the nuclear submarine fleet and any nuclear carriers. And this particular company that I'm not an investor in at this point, just really supporting, cheerleading them, is they've got over 30 ex-Navy nuke people working on this, and they hope to be cutting metal as soon as next year. But they haven't really gotten anything in the field operating where you can say it's really functional. But I think that a lot of stuff is starting to coalesce, and this could really be a game changer for humanity. Let's hope so, because we can't.
I'd love to get in touch with that company, actually, if you don't mind. If you don't mind connecting me with them, I'd love to get in touch with them.
I will definitely do that for sure. They'd be thrilled to talk to you. But it does lead to another point here, which is, I mean, the idea: can we really throw tens of millions of new EVs on the grid, the Western grid, and can we really come up with enough of the necessary resources for the batteries, even for the transmission, even thinking about the grid itself and the number of new transmission lines that have to be built and put in place to make this happen. And it just strikes me as, totally impossible dream, but, maybe you have a more upbeat view of it.
Yeah, I think that, I think I don't have a more upbeat view of it. I think it's an impossible dream, but I think the data would suggest that it's so plain that it's impossible that you have to go deeper. I think we have to go deeper, David, which is not just stopping at the empirical implausibility of the proposition, but we have to go deeper and ask what's driving it then, because we're all looking at the same facts and different people are coming to a different conclusion. And I think that some of this has to expose the cynical interests that are at stake. The marketing interests of large asset managers who are able to use this to dupe their everyday retail investors and consumers to be able to give them funds to represent voices in these boardrooms to drive these transition plans that are neither good for long run profit nor good for humanity or the environment. I think those things aren't an accident that all of those things are true at the same time, while they make more money on the other side of the planet by saying the exact opposite things to the Chinese companies that they invest in raising funds from their Chinese investors. So I think that we have to see through just the implausibility, where I think a lot of folks earnestly, like yourself, will sort of point to the facts and say, this is just implausible. Well, I think that we're not going to actually advance the debate until we smoke out some of the cynical agendas that are driving those otherwise implausible claims and goals. Because it's only when we see those with clarity that we're actually going to be able to shift the debate to a more rational place. And so, I don't mean to be, I'm actually quite an optimist at the end of the day. You may not come across in this conversation, but I think that we have to, the path to optimism runs through first seeing the problem with clear eyes. And I think that in many ways, this is an agenda that is driven in part ideologically by certain activists as an attack on human flourishing, particularly in the West, and particularly to apologize for the prosperity of part of the world over the rest of the world, and using the climate and energy debate as a vehicle to advance an agenda that's more motivated by global equity. And then you combine that with the cynical, self-interested financial forces of large financial institutions and asset managers like BlackRock that have converged to give us an otherwise nonsensical set of propositions for how to go about achieving this climate transition. And I think the thing that we have to recognize in order to get to the root cause of this, before we get to a more optimistic place, is the fact that actually none of this had to do with climate change. It was using climate change as a vehicle for advancing debates that otherwise would not have survived in their own right if they had withstood public scrutiny, because the public wouldn't have mustered the support for advancing the global equity agenda through the front door. And so they had to use the back door through existential threats to humanity, or at least the claims of existential threats to humanity, and unidirectional means of addressing those existential threats as a way to marshal those same outcomes, but by using a different rallying cry instead. That's what I think is going on. Now, the good news is, once we see it, what's the path to a better set of solutions? Great. We can now open up the possibility for a rational dialogue around the use of nuclear energy to address the possible effects of global climate change, even if our certainty about what those measures are uncertain. Great. Whatever role carbon dioxide may or may not, whether or not our carbon dioxide levels may or may not be optimally at their high level, nuclear energy offers us a great backup strategy on which we can rely in a way that wind and solar absolutely don't. We can actually talk about technologies that allow us to continue our reliance and even expand our reliance on fossil fuels, while using the combination of both our scientific understanding as well as our financial instincts to engage in, for example, capturing the carbon, put it back in the ground, and then make money twice off the same unit of carbon. Capture it as methane, liquefy it, sell it as natural gas. We're able to have those debates, I think, with greater clarity and with greater effectiveness when we're not jousting with an argument that's doing the work from behind the scenes that had nothing to do with climate change or the energy debate in the first place, which is part of the point of smoking it out.
Well, those are very controversial statements that I happen to agree with. I think you're a very brave man, which is one thing I wanted to bring up, is that in your book, Woke Incorporated, your first book, the New York Times bestseller, you used the C word in reference to yourself, conservative, which these days that's hard to say. And, I have to be candid here, because politically, I'm in a little bit different place. In fact, I'm the Washington State co-chairman for No Labels. And I don't know if you know the No Labels organization, but it was co-founded by Howard Marks back in 2010.
I like No Labels. I mean,
You do know?
I don't know. But it sounds good based on just the title of it. I'm saying I like the idea of No Labels. Yeah.
Their number one representative in Congress is Senator Joe Manchin. Okay. He's been a part of No Labels for about a decade, and there are 29 Republicans and 29 Democrat representatives in the House that are part of what's called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And given the finely balanced, nature of Congress right now, they've been able to exert quite a bit of influence in terms of blocking some of the really extreme legislation that was going to be piled on. Remember the Build Back Better bill? So I'm more, to use another C word, centrist, but even, what I admire about you.
One thing, David, is I said that not because the identity or of being conservative label is important to me. I wanted to just put cards on the table saying that, okay, if you look at my total set of views, they might be on the conservative end of the spectrum, but it was as a means to the end, for those who read the book, they know this, to say that those labels absolutely don't matter with respect to the debate we're having. You could be liberal, Democratic, Republican. What if we care about the revival of the integrity of capitalism and democracy, of restoring the voice of the everyday citizen to resolve political questions through the political process and depoliticizing the private sector? I don't care if you're a conservative, a liberal, a centrist, whatever label you use. These are questions that transcend partisanship. They even transcend national boundaries, actually. These are transpartisan, transnational questions. And so what I want to do is, it was the reason I even used the C word there was just to sort of transparently get cards on the table. But before we just say that, you know what, those cards don't even matter because that's not even the game we're playing. Right. I thought it was really just as a mark of honesty as opposed to a label that actually meant particularly much to me.
Well, you're right. And one of the things that I feel is really essential is that you get away from kind of the liberal conservative thing, which is, of course, part of the no labels mission, but also the idea that there are rational policies and there's irrational policies. And of course, that becomes somewhat controversial. You can say, well, how do you really determine what's rational and what's irrational? And I would say, does it work? Does it really, when it's done, does it work? And let's use an example here recently, and I know that we're getting probably close to your time limit, but MMT, which is something I was writing about in my newsletter back in the spring of 2019 when it was, nobody really thought it was going to be put in practice. Even our brightest clients would say, what's MMT? And I said, well, believe me, we're going to be trying it in this country here fairly soon. And the idea that it was the miracle solution. And, so COVID comes along and now we put it into practice and we have people. So interestingly, Paul Krugman was very anti-MMT when Trump basically did it because he was the first kind of stumbled into it. When they had the repo crisis back in September 2019, which started QE4. But then once it was really taking a hyperdrive under the Biden administration, Krugman was a big cheerleader. Yeah. Unlike anything Paul Krugman's ever done, he admitted he was wrong here recently. I was shocked. He said, I was wrong. It did create a lot of inflation because there were those of us right from the get-go. And Howard Marks was one of those. And Jeremy Siegel was one of those. And I wrote about this repeatedly. MMT is going to be a big inflation problem. And the Fed's going to not have the ability, they don't have the tools to be able to effectively respond to it once it really gets out of the bottle. But anyway, my point is there are policies that make sense and there are policies that don't make sense. And I think one of the problems that we have is that if something sounds good socially, we go, oh, we got to do it. We just have no choice but to do it. And I think this great green energy transition is a classic example of that.
And it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, even in my next book, one of the things I point out, it's a Nation of Victims, the one that's coming out now, is that actually, as it relates to those MMT issues, Trump, Josh Hawley, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, they're all on the same side of this debate, actually. So this is something that actually definitely transcends partisanship, where we pretend like the partisan divisions are actually the ones that cleanly and neatly divide public policy choices. We live in a moment where actually no labels might be the better way to go, because when you think about the debate even about passing the coronavirus stimulus packages, Trump, Hawley, Harris, and Bernie Sanders were all on the side of holding up the bill unless they increased it to $2,000 per person from $1,600. So in a certain sense, shoehorning these into Republican Democratic divides on many of these debates is a false distinction that I think is in some ways designed by the people who are the architects of that system to trick the public. So I'm a fan of seeing this prism through beyond partisan lenses. My next book's all about that. Frankly, it's why Strive, and what we're doing, building with Strive, this has nothing to do with political partisanship. It has to do with competing in the marketplace with institutions like BlackRock and large financial institutions along with them that talk out of both sides of their mouth to please people on either side of the alleged partisan boundary, when in fact the real problem was the aggregation of power by a small handful of actors that were using force to substitute for free speech and open debate to settle these questions. That's actually the real issue that I care about more than a Republican issue or a Democratic one. So I'm glad we got to that part of the discussion.
Well, and again, I want to compliment your bravery, your courage, because what I really appreciate is your constant championing of free speech, because it does alarm me that we're seeing so much free speech suppression. It happens in the climate debate. It happens in the political debate. It's just unfortunately pervasive. I think it's probably the greatest threat to American democracy that's out there right now. And whether it's from the left or the right, anything that suppresses free speech is reprehensible. So we should talk maybe about your new book, just real briefly here, Nation of Victims. Yeah. So it does build on some of the themes from Woke Incorporated, I presume?
Yes, it does. I think of it as a sequel to Woke Inc. I think the thesis of this book is that we used to have a national identity built on the shared pursuit of excellence as Americans. That has been replaced by a new national identity built on victimhood instead. Black victimhood, white victimhood, second generation Asian American victimhood, liberal victimhood, conservative victimhood. We are a nation of victims. But at the end of the day, I think that while that is responsible, I think for a large part of our national decline and the cultural decline in our country, it's still not too late to turn it around. We can revive a shared national identity that goes back to unapologetically pursuing excellence. But the bridge from victimhood to excellence runs through a really uncomfortable place in the middle. And that path runs through difficult terrain that we might call forgiveness. And I think that that is a virtue that we might revive in our country, to put down arms at the same time. And the heart of the case I actually make in the new book is the path from victimhood to excellence actually runs through forgiveness. And that's the quiet case. That's the subtext of the entire book. And I hope that it has an impact on our culture. At the end of the day, we used to be a nation, speaking of the free speech topic, that said that, look, classically, this country was built on a vision that said that I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. And instead, we've become a nation that instead says now, I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for my right to stop you from saying it. And I think that the first was the hallmark of a nation that was on its ascent. The second would become the hallmark of a nation that's on its decline. I do trace the history of Rome for several chapters in the book. And one of the things that I reminded myself of in doing the research for this book is actually that there was no one rise of Rome and there was no one fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls. And so to the people who may fall into the trap of saying that we're now in the decline of the American experiment, I say that, you know what? The jury's not quite out on that yet. There were many declines and many falls, and we can still constantly be reborn as the true version of ourselves. And I hope that now is one of those moments where we can muster the courage and even the interest and the curiosity as a people to be reborn as the thing that we set into motion in 1776. So that's what this book is about. It offers my vision for a shared national identity, filling a vacuum that we, I think, badly need to fill at this moment in our history. And the way I say we fill the vacuum is revive American identity, shared American identity around the unapologetic pursuit of excellence. That's part of what it means to be American. And that can fill our hunger for purpose and meaning and identity and shared national identity above all at a moment where we lack one. So that's what the new book's about. It's September 13th, anyone can get it. But I hope that, as of September 13th, it was widely available, and hopefully I get some good feedback on it.
I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
It's,
I'm hopeful you'll like this one. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Vivek, I apologize. We've gone over an hour here, but you've been incredibly generous with your time and extremely articulate as I expected. And so I just want to thank you very much. And I hope that we can have you back on again.
That was a fun conversation. Thanks a lot. I look forward to it.
And by the way, before I let you go, Strive, and you've got obviously got your website. I know you have a team set up to reach out to people to tell the story of DRLL. And so anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, sure. So folks can learn more about Strive at strive.com. But the way to think about Strive in a nutshell is we're competing with the largest asset managers in the world, firms like BlackRock, by bringing a different voice and vote to the table. It actually relates to the conversation we were just having about my next book in some ways, about the revival of excellence. Strive's message to corporate America is that companies should focus exclusively on delivering excellent products and services to their customers without regard to any other social or political or cultural agenda, period. However worthy those social or political agendas should be, we should work that out through the political process in our capacity as citizens. But corporate America's boardrooms should focus exclusively on excellence, both product excellence and financial excellence over the long run. That's the voice we're bringing to the table. And so, look, there may be a lot of clients out there who say that, no, you know what? I want to use my money to drive political change or to drive environmental change. And you know what? It's a free country. And so for all of those people, there's probably a different asset manager who's probably a better home for your capital. But for the folks who want to invest exclusively with the objective of maximizing their long run financial goals, that's why we wanted to create Strive, to bring a voice in corporate America's boardrooms through proxy voting, through shareholder engagement that aligns with that objective on behalf of clients. And I think the truth today is that a lot of people may have their money invested in places like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, who are using their money to advance social and political goals in corporate America's boardrooms that many of those everyday clients don't agree with. What I said is, look, if this is a problem in the market, it needs to be solved through the market. Let's create a new alternative. That's what Strive was built on. And I'm proud to say that we did have a successful launch of our first index fund, is the one that you mentioned. It was a U.S. energy index fund that listed on the New York Stock Exchange on August 9th. That ticker was very simple: DRILL, DRLL, drill, which it was succinctly capturing a message. But the broad message to the U.S. energy sector is the same message that Strive's bringing to the table. Focus on excellence, not on politics. And yes, that might mean drilling or fracking or doing whatever allows you to be most successful over the long run. You don't have to apologize for it. Focus on what maximizes long-run financial return. And that's your job as an energy company. And I hope that new shareholder voice is something that can change the behavior of this industry. It was at the heart of my letter, my shareholder letter that I sent to the board of Chevron earlier this week. It was at the heart of the message that we've delivered to other energy companies that we've engaged with since even the listing of that first fund. And I hope that this is a positive movement that we're able to build in capital markets and in corporate America. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to take scale to achieve that. But we're just getting started, and I hope that we're able to have our version of a positive impact as well.
That's great, Vivek. Thank you again. Enjoy your weekend. You need some rest. It's been probably the busiest week of your life. I don't know. You've had a pretty amazing life. So maybe you've had other weeks like this, but anyway, you're amazing. Keep up the great work.
Appreciate the dialogue. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we'll take care.